I speak at a lot of different events all over the world, and pretty much like everybody who ever speaks, when I stand up at the beginning of the speech, I always begin by saying, thank you so much to the person who invited me here to speak. I'm so honored to be here. And the weirdest thing is like this very bizarre sensation, because in this case tonight, I actually mean it. And it's really strange. And I want to talk a little bit about why I'm so honored and actually genuinely humbled to be here and to have been asked to speak, because I'm actually really new to this cause. It's only been within the last couple of years that I've really focused my efforts politically and journalistically and emotionally and psychologically on the cause of animal liberation. And it's really all of you who inspired me and paved the way for me to do that. And you know, it's really true when just in terms of the thoughts that I've formulated over the last decade working on journalism and politics and on law before that, for me, animal rights activism and the activists who compose the movement demonstrate the two attributes that I genuinely regard as the most admirable and the most inspirational. The first being a commitment to speaking on behalf of those who are powerless and voiceless and who are being oppressed by those who are powerful and who abuse their power in the course of that oppression. And the second is a willingness to sacrifice your own self-interest in pursuit of that cause. And I have worked on a lot of different political movements over the last decade and have covered a lot of different kinds of activism, and there is nowhere where these two attributes are as vibrant and as vivid and as inspiring as they are within this movement and within this country. So I do want to talk a little bit about my own story about how I came to animal rights activism, and then also to giving up meat, and then ultimately vegetarianism and veganism, because it reminds me a little bit of the gay community, where everybody has their own coming out story. Because, you know, people are born gay, but nobody's born openly gay. So there's always a point at which they decide that they're going to be openly gay, and the story that they tell about how they came to do that is always very enlightening about who they are and what their perspective is, and it often inspires other people. And I find stories that people tell about how they came to animal rights activism and how they came to be vegetarians and vegans to be very similar in that regard. Those stories typically aren't told with quite as much drama and flair, obviously, that goes without saying, but they nonetheless are, I think, very enlightening and very profound. And my story is actually almost banal. It's really a simplistic story, and in the simplicity, I actually find a lot of meaning. So a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, my husband and I were traveling around the US for this very intensive speaking tour, and it was actually quite a miserable week. We were traveling to a different city every single week, speaking at night, waking up at like 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, going to the airport, being trapped in an airport, then in a plane, flying to the next city, getting out, having 3 hours to decompress, speaking again, waking up the next morning. And do that, we were sleep deprived, we were irritated, we basically were hating each other in a way that only married couples can hate each other, and just wanting to murder each other. It was just high intense drama and tension and resentment and annoyance and frustration. And so in the second to the last city of what was like a 7-day speaking tour, we flew to Western Massachusetts because I was speaking at Amherst. And the professor who invited us to speak said to me, hey, I know you guys both love animals. We have like 2 hours before your speech. If you want, there's a farm next to my house. You can come to my house and kind of hang out at the farm for a while if that's something that you want to do. And because we basically were trapped in airports for the entire week and then trapped in auditoriums speaking, we said, yes, we want to do that. And we went there, and as soon as we got to the border of the fence, there was this family of cows, and they were just kind of looking at us. And the family of cows that were looking at us were kind of interacting with one another. They were each interacting with us in a certain way. And the thing that I noticed instantly was that each of our energy had been immediately transformed. Both my husband David and I had gone from spending the week fantasizing about ways that we could drown each other without getting caught to remembering that, oh my God, we actually love each other and we're happy to be alive and look at how beautiful things are. And it just instantly transformed our entire being. Instantly, within like literally 30 seconds of just looking at these cows. And I remember after the hour that we spent there, just sitting on the dirt, watching the calves and watching the male cows and the female cows and the complexity of their interaction and the way that their energy infected us, we didn't really say much. And then at the end I just said, I'm never eating one of those again. And to that state, And I actually thought a lot about why this like weird random family of cows in Western Massachusetts so radically transformed my behavior, because they did. And one of the things that I thought so much about is the capacity of animals to just foster what is best in us and disperse and dispense what is worst in us, just through their sheer energy of being and their tranquility and their peace. And I also obviously observed their social complexity and emotional sophistication, and the way some of them were a bit more aggressive in guarding who we were and protecting their babies, and the others who were a bit more social, and the other ones who were just kind of observing us, and you could see the personality differences and the emotional fulfillment and the drives that each of them had. But I think what struck me the most about that family of cows was it gave me this feeling of interconnectivity. I felt no longer like I was a human being over here and they were some other things over there. I felt that our lives, that our souls, that our energies were actually part of the same overall being. They had infected our energy in a way that transformed our mind and our mood and our mentality in such a profound and deep-seated way. And it is a banal story. It really is nothing else that more than us hanging out with a bunch of cows for a week. I mean, for an hour rather. It felt like a week. It was just for an hour. But it really did transform how I think about animals in so many ways. And one of the things that it actually caused, because I did radically change my diet after that, was I actually started feeling very disturbed, guilty, ashamed of the fact that this transformation had occurred pretty late in my life. I had lived on this planet for decades and had consumed meat without giving the slightest thought to the moral consequences of what my choices were. And that's a really disturbing thing to have to come to realize about yourself, because we all value the fact that we are rational beings. We all like to think that we're in control of the things that we're doing. We like to think that we're informed about the world and that we make decisions about who we are and what we do, paying attention to the effect that it has on others. And yet somehow I had spent many decades, not that many, but a fair number of decades, completely oblivious to the consequences of my choices. How was it that I had gone through my entire childhood and then young adulthood and beyond, loving animals, rescuing dogs, wanting pets, being horrified by animal abuse, and yet consuming products that could only be given to me by virtue of the systematic torture and an extinguishment and slaughter of these same animals for whom I felt such affection? How was I able to live with such division in my head in the way that I thought about the world? That was something that really disturbed and baffled me. And I actually have spent a lot of time thinking about that, because I don't think that's uncommon. And I think it's a really interesting aspect of animal rights and activism and animal liberation. Activism is that I know for a lot of different causes, a lot of times you actually have to change the person's fundamental value system. So I've done a lot of work against militarism and imperialism, and you have to really make people change the value that they place on the lives of people who aren't of the same nationality as them. And I've done a lot of work on Islamophobia and the oppression of Muslims in the United States, and you have to really get people to think radically differently about what they value and their hierarchy of concerns in order for them to induce them to think differently. But with animal rights activism, that's not really true. There are a huge number of people who are not animal rights activists and who don't spend much time thinking about industrial torture of animals and who consume meat without the slightest pangs of guilt, who nonetheless really do feel empathy and who love animals. And so it's actually a really interesting and I think encouraging aspect of animal rights activism that you don't actually have to radically change people's hierarchy of values or radically and fundamentally get them to think differently about the world. You just have to do something that kind of opens them up to what's already inside of them and making them aware of what it is that they were doing. And the way that I know that is from my own personal experience, from having thought about how it could be that I could contribute to such evil. It wasn't because I morally thought, thank you, this evil was okay. It was because I just hadn't paid any attention to the fact that the slab of meat on my plate had once been a cow or a pig or a turkey or some other living being for whom I felt empathy. And I think this is really the main challenge of animal rights activism, is to try and find a way to tap into that. So the first time I wrote about animal rights activism as a journalist was in 2015, and I remember very vividly what happened. I got a call from someone who has since become one of my true heroes in life, Lauren Gazzola. And I don't know how many of you know her, but I can just tell you that if you ever find yourself on the phone with Lauren Gazzola, you should just resign yourself to the fact that your life is radically going to change and that you're going to just start thinking differently about the world in all sorts of profound ways. And she had called me to tell me that there was this criminal case that had just been brought by the federal government here in Oakland where two very young animal rights activists were charged with terrorism, literally as being terrorists, not for harming anybody or blowing anybody up, but for opening cages in which minks were trapped who were going to be shredded and slaughtered in order to make coats out of them. They weren't charged with destruction of property or theft or vandalism or trespassing. They were literally charged with terrorism. And I became so riveted by this case, but only on kind of an intellectual and political and journalistic level, and not quite yet a human level. I wasn't really ready yet to confront the true evils and true horrors that we allow to take place systematically in terms of what's done to animals. But I was at least compelled by the kind of abstract and theoretical issues that this case provoked. And they were really important. And one of the things that I realized almost immediately upon looking into this and interviewing people and reading up on the framework that had been created over the course of 15 years to enable such a travesty of justice to happen was that it was very, very, very similar to all of the other political activism and the journalism I had been doing, even though it seemed so radically different, like such a remarkable departure. So basically for the last 10 or 15 years, both as a lawyer and then as a journalist, my focus has been on things like civil liberties and the right of privacy and the excesses committed under the war on terrorism and the persecution of Muslims both abroad and here in the United States, and all of the perversions of ethics and law and morality carried out in its name. I worked a lot on issues like free speech and the right of dissent, and obviously on the excesses of government surveillance and the attempt to turn the internet into a tool of control. It doesn't really seem like it has a lot in common with animal rights. But it actually does. It has everything in common with those causes. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about why. So one of the really fascinating aspects of the war on terror is the word terrorism itself. If you look at this word, it's an amazing paradox because the word is so powerful. It can dictate and determine almost everything that happens under law. Anything that is justified in the name of terrorism becomes inherently justified. And yet, this word, which is so on the one hand, limitlessly powerful, on the other, is almost entirely devoid of any actual definition. It doesn't mean anything. There's no consistent, defined application of what this word means. And if you look at the history of why, it's because it began about 4 decades ago when the United States and Israel wanted to go to the United Nations and get countries around the world to oppose the targeting of civilians in the name of political causes or political ends. And when they wanted to do that, they faced this really challenging problem, which is, wait a minute, how can we create international norms designed to punish the targeting of civilians with military force for political ends without simultaneously, and pretty much principally, ending up targeting ourselves? That was a real dilemma for the United States and Israel. And so what they came up with was, they said, well, let's just call it a new term, terrorism, and let's say that it is the targeting of individuals who are civilians for political ends carried out by non-state actors. So they just kind of arbitrarily define themselves out of it. And then what you have is this term, and you see it applied in the most amazing ways. So if the United States invades another country like Iraq or Afghanistan, and people in that country take up arms and use them, not against civilians, but against soldiers of an occupying army, those people are called terrorists. And they're actually people who have spent many years in Guantanamo as terrorists for doing exactly that. But if the United States destroys an entire city called Baghdad with the deliberate intention to terrorize the population, calling it shock and awe, or if the Israeli government shoots innocent, peaceful protesters using snipers in the back or the head, that can't be terrorism because that's carried out by state actors. In fact, often the victims themselves are the people who get called terrorists. So it's a word that has no meaning. It's completely pliable. It's entirely a term of propaganda. It's wielded by whoever has the most power against those who are the most powerless. So imagine, it's very similar, 2 young people in their 20s knowing that there are living beings capable of great suffering and pain and emotional complexity who are about to be fed into a shredder for no reason other than to make expensive coats for rich people around the world to wear for fashion, who liberate them. Those people get branded terrorists, but the people who take these living beings and subject them to immense torture and suffering and pain for no reason other than commercial profit and commercial gain are the ones who wield that label of terrorism and punish people accordingly. And so, it really resonated for me in terms of so much of the work that I had been doing. And then there's so many other obvious ways. All of these laws are written by people who own and control the government. There was just a recent case, as all of you know, in which several DXE activists were charged with felonies for essentially taking 2 or 3 pigs who were hours or days away from dying, who had no commercial value whatsoever, in order to rescue them and nurture them back to health. And I remember when I went to report on that and then did report on it, everybody was baffled and said, how is it that taking products that have no commercial value or trivial commercial value can possibly be a felony? In almost every state, in order for theft to be a felony, obviously stealing a stick of bubble gum is not a felony because it doesn't rise to a certain commercial value. It can't be a felony, so how could this possibly be a felony? And the answer was, because the agricultural industry controls the lawmaking process in these states' democracies, they've written into the law an exception that says theft is a felony if it entails the taking of something in excess of $1,500, unless it's livestock, in which case it's just a felony no matter what. And so all the work that I had done in terms of how democracy is an illusion and how it's been corrupted was also incredibly evident in this case as well. But I think the real crux of the similarity that I immediately saw between this prosecution and then subsequent prosecutions like it, and all of the work that I had done previously on all of the issues that I had described for you, and what really compelled me and to this day animates me journalistically and politically to be so compelled by this cause, is what it says about the right of dissent and the right of free speech. So I just want to tell you a couple of formative anecdotes that really shaped how I think about these issues over the last decade that happened to me, and this is kind of the framework that I bring to all of these issues. So in 2008, I was one of the first people ever to write about WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks is now primarily associated in our domestic partisan wars with the 2016 election, but before that, they were really regarded as kind of on the edge of radical transparency, of shining light on what the world's most powerful factions were doing in the dark. And in 2008, almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks because it was before their extraordinarily impactful disclosures of the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and the diplomatic cables released by the heroic Chelsea Manning. And I found out about WikiLeaks because in 2008, the US Army had written a manual, a top secret manual, in which they had talked about the danger posed by WikiLeaks and declared it to be an enemy of the state. By this point, WikiLeaks had already done some leaks. They had exposed corruption, corporate waste dumping in Kenya. They had exposed lies by the Australian government, some banking fraud among Western European financial elites, but the framework is what scared the US military the most, the idea that they were devoted to radical transparency. So the US Army prepared a top secret document declaring WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. And that document, ironically enough, got leaked to WikiLeaks, which published it on their website. And there was this very short article in the New York Times about it, and it talked about how the US Army had declared this bizarre, obscure transparency group led by this shady Australian hacker to be an enemy of the state. And I read the article, and my interest was immediately piqued because I kind of thought to myself, well, any group that the US Army considers to be an enemy of the state is one that I'm interested in and probably supportive of. And so I arranged for an interview with Julian Assange and a few other early WikiLeaks volunteers. And I wrote a really long article, I think 3,000 words, talking about the promise of this model for transparency and for shedding a light on what evil factions do in the dark. And at the end of it, I encouraged my readers to donate money to WikiLeaks because they had told me and they had showed me that they were sitting on some really important large leaks that could make a really big difference in the world, but didn't have the resources to properly process them and to vet them and then to publish them. And so I remember at the end of the article, I provided links to how people could donate to WikiLeaks via PayPal or BankWire or other means. And in response to my doing that, I had hundreds of people in every kind of venue, in the comment section of my article, by email, at events like this, say to me, and these were not, like the really super paranoid people. I'm very adept at recognizing those. These were like very rational, sober people who said to me, like, look, I sympathize with your defense of WikiLeaks, and I see the potential and the promise that this transparency model provides. But I'm actually really reluctant to donate money to WikiLeaks. And the reason is that I'm really worried that if I donate money to WikiLeaks, I'm gonna end up on a list of some kind, some government list. And at some point in the future, who knows, if WikiLeaks is declared to be a terrorist organization, I could be charged with material support for terrorism or some other unknown sanction or punishment. And I remember that was so striking to me, was so consequential for me, because at the time, and still, WikiLeaks is an organization that has never been charged with, let alone convicted of any crime. And yet somehow, there were these huge numbers of American citizens who were afraid to exercise what were their core and pure rights of association and free speech by donating money to a political group and a journalism group whose cause they supported. They were afraid to exercise their own rights because of the consequences that they thought would befall them. And I had a very similar experience around the same time, 2008, 2009, 2010. And this is what really shaped my passion and my devotion to the causes of civil liberty. I spent a lot of those years, because of the writing I was doing on the war on terror and the persecution of Muslims, traveling around the US and speaking to a lot of Muslim communities in the United States who were most interested in these issues for obvious reasons. And the thing that always struck me the most was how I would hear the same things at every single event that I would go and speak at in Muslim communities here in the United States. I would hear stories like some 18-year-old kid who was born here in the United States, but whose family was from Somalia, who worked a summer job and saved up enough money to go back to Somalia for the first time, to visit his grandmother who still lived there, who he wanted to meet for the first time, only to arrive at the airport and be told that he wasn't allowed to board the plane because some unknown secret government official had put him on a no-fly list for reasons that he didn't know and without any ability to appeal it. Or I would hear from people who would tell me that at their mosque, whenever someone new would show up at the mosque, instead of welcoming them and embracing them and encouraging them the way that their religion has taught them to do and mandates them to do, they instead automatically assume that the new person had been sent by the FBI to be an informant to monitor them and to watch what it is they were doing. And so instead of welcoming them with warmth, they instead regarded them with great suspicion. And I heard Muslim students in college tell me on many occasions, and with really good reason, that they were afraid to do what is one of the core activities of being an undergraduate at a college is about, which is having discussions and debates about politics and culture with your peers, because they were really afraid that if they said something that somebody perceived was just a little too hostile toward the United States government or its foreign policy, or a little too critical in a tone that was a little bit too sharp about American political leaders, that they could end up on some kind of list or even be charged at some point with some kind of crimes relating to radicalism. Something that has happened many times in this country, where people were charged with being part of or lending material support to terrorist groups because of opinions that they could express. And what all of that showed me, and the reason I regarded it as so formative, that thing with WikiLeaks, the things I heard from Muslim communities, the work that I had been doing on the erosion of rights, was that these were all people who were relinquishing their own guaranteed political rights, not because there was a gun put to their head forcing them to do it. They weren't people who were imprisoned because of their political expression, or people who were rounded up and killed or put into camps because of the protests they were engaging in. They were people who voluntarily relinquished their political rights because of well-grounded fears that they would be punished if they did exercise them in a way that people who wield power and authority dislike. And you can have all of the political rights guaranteed on really pretty parchments, and you can write songs in tribute to them and pay homage to them in ceremonies in front of monuments, but they're completely meaningless if you can bully and coerce and threaten a population out of exercising. You know, I think that that is the core lesson of what is happening in animal rights activism. Obviously, the reason that people are being prosecuted as felons for rescuing 3 dying piglets of commercial value or for liberating minks isn't because anybody cares about the loss of property or believes that any terrorism has been committed. The reason they're doing that is the same reason they want people to be afraid of donating money to groups that they find threatening. It's the same reason they want Muslims to believe that if they even express a political opinion too critical of the government, that they could actually end up being punished. It's because they want to create a climate of fear. They want you to be afraid that if you engage in any meaningful or effective dissent, you will be harmed, you will be punished, you will be sanctioned in some way. And ultimately, that is the nature of power, right? Like, we all love to talk about speaking truth to power and standing up to power, but ultimately, that's all power means. That's all it really is about. It's about the ability to impose injury and deprivation and suffering and pain and loss on people who defy you or who impede your interests. And that is how liberty is deprived in the United States, not through the flashy, flamboyant, overt ways of setting up camps for political dissidents. It's by creating a prison in the mind where you're taught and trained that the only way that you can remain safe and secure is by complying and submitting and remaining acquiescent. And the way that you will face danger is if you confront power and authority. That is what these prosecutions are about, and that is the challenge as activists not to let yourself succumb to. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what kind of was my next step in my evolution towards being here, basically, and devoting myself to this cause. And as I said this afternoon, I regard myself as kind of like an infant when it comes to animal rights activism and eating ethically, because I'm probably newer to the cause than the vast majority of people in this room, and I feel like I have so much more to learn about it than I do to teach about it, and that's one of the main reasons that I'm here. In fact, I flew, I don't even know how long it is because I'm so confused by time zones, but I think something like 20 hours with my husband to be here. We got here just yesterday and we're leaving tomorrow. We came only for this conference, and the reason we did that is because I wanted to come and learn and be inspired. I don't really feel like I have much to come and teach about animal rights activism or animal liberation. It's something that I'm still forming my own thoughts about and my own commitment to in the ways that I want to contribute to the cause. And it really is because of people like you and the work that you've done and the things that you've shown and forced me to see that I didn't want to see, that almost without a choice, I ended up committing myself to this cause. And the evolution has been interesting, not because my evolution is interesting, but because I think it shines light on the question that we all need to ask, which is how do we expand this activism beyond the confines of this wall, beyond the people who are already converted. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I kind of consider the final step of my journey, because I started off loving animals. I always liked dogs. My husband and I have spent the last decade rescuing dogs. We have 24 dogs ourselves in our house, which I know makes us kind of crazy. And I'll go ahead and say that's our limit, but you can like literally Google and you'll find me saying to various reporters in 2010, 2012, 8 is our absolute, 14 is definitely, we're never gonna go over 18. So, I could tell you 24 is the limit, but I would know, and you would know that I'm totally lying. And when I come here next year, I'll probably have 28 or so. So I'll save myself that embarrassment. So I always loved dogs, and we've done a lot with dogs. And then because of those cows, I stopped eating meat and stopped eating pork and then stopped eating chicken. And I'm continually evolving in my diet for those same reasons. And then I started devoting myself journalistically and intellectually and politically to the cause of animal rights for all the reasons that I just talked about, but I still never quite made that last step of forcing myself to truly confront on the most visceral level the true extent and nature of the evil that is carried out in the name of industrial farms and animal agriculture until very, very recently. And this is the hump that I think is the hardest one to get over. We really do have a natural instinct to turn away from the things that horrify us. It's a natural instinct, it's not really a moral calculus. I remember about 5 years ago, I was in the back of a cab in Rio de Janeiro where I live. And we were coming up to this crosswalk, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this woman who was about 75 years old walked into the middle of the intersection, and the light was green, so the cab driver was going pretty quickly. And before I could say anything, my brain calculated and recognized that our hitting her was inevitable. We were like less than a second away. And so I couldn't articulate anything, I couldn't say anything, and I just instinctively, I just shut my eyes because I didn't want to see what I knew was about to happen. The cab did end up hitting her, but fortunately he braked enough and she just had a few scratches. She wasn't seriously injured, but it looked like he was going to run her over. And I didn't intervene. I didn't stop him from doing that. My instinct instead was to shut my eyes because my brain told me there's nothing you can do. It's an inevitability. You can't stop it. And this is the instinct that has led me for so many decades to simultaneously love animals and yet at the same time consume them and eat them and support an industry that slaughters and tortures them. It was the instinct to turn away. I saw animal rights films on the internet, and I just didn't click them because I didn't want to subject myself to the emotions that I was going to endure by having to do that. And so I allowed myself to morally abdicate my responsibility as a human being to face the consequences of my choices. But I think it's important that I assume most of you have done that at some point in your life. As I said earlier, there's usually a point where we recognize that consuming meat and similar animal products is wrong, and then we make the choice not to do it, which means for some point we allow ourselves to be propagandized and deceived. And I think it's important not to be too hard on ourselves and others, because except in cases when we're talking about sociopaths, I don't think it's because someone is morally evil or misguided. I think it's just that they are succumbing to their instinct to turn away. And that's the challenge that we have. So I want to just talk a little bit about my own experience. And hopefully there are some lessons to learn in terms of how we can get people to stop turning away. So where I live in Rio de Janeiro, which is in Brazil, it's a city and a country with grave inequality. There's extreme levels of poverty and suffering and deprivation, much worse than even here in the United States, which certainly has a huge share of its own, but it's worse in Brazil. And so there's a very large homeless population that lives on the street. When I first started living in Rio de Janeiro in 2005, so 13 years ago or so, I would often see homeless people on the street and notice that actually, more than almost any city I had ever visited, a huge number of homeless people lived on the streets with pets, sometimes cats, but usually dogs. And I had assumed at first that they were doing it cynically to manipulate people who loved animals into giving them money, which I think is a common reaction. And then I also had this kind of sentiment, which lasted kind of a long time, which is I felt sorry for the dogs. I thought to myself, it's a really terrible existence for a dog to have to endure through no fault of its own that it had to live on the street. These are bad thoughts. These are not thoughts that I'm proud of or that I'm advocating. But I think they're things that is what our brain naturally does when we don't intervene and try and stop it. It's sort of a natural course that our brain takes because of culture and because of assumptions and because of the way we experience the world. And as we began rescuing dogs more and more, we actually began focusing more and more on the homeless population and the dogs that they have. And what we actually found, when I say we, I mean my husband and I, was the exact opposite of those assumptions. I remember there were times when I would go up to the people who were living on the streets with their dogs and I would offer them to buy them something. And I usually would say, let me buy you a leash. Because I know for me, my biggest fear is that I would get separated from my dog.
Do we have cake?
Dude, there's another one over there.
Oh.
Try the other mic.
Oh, the other mic?
There's another mic. Try the other mic.
What is it? Oh, okay. Is that working?
It's
Oh,
bad.
yeah,
Okay,
there you go.
So we found that all of our assumptions about these homeless people were wrong, and we would offer them always to buy leashes because we didn't want them to be separated, and they would say, I don't need a leash, my dog never leaves my side. And if I have to leave, she or he waits for me here, and she always is able to find me when I come back. I don't need a leash, I need medication or food or anything else like that. And that always really struck me because I do need a leash for my dogs. My dogs will instantly take off and say, oh, that looks way more interesting over there, and then we'll be separated. But for the dogs and the homeless people who are living together in the street, the leash is unnecessary. They have something that binds them that I don't have with my dogs. And then I started kind of being an investigator in this very cynical way and wanting to see how they would behave when nobody was around. They would kind of lurk and watch even greater affection and love being expressed when nobody was there, and realized that my cynicism was actually completely unwarranted. And I would also a lot of times see that if you go and find a person who looks really hungry on the street and buy them food, the first thing that they do is not eat it, but give it to their pet. And there's actually now a lot of social science research about the unique bond that forms between homeless people and their pets. There's in fact a sociology professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder named Leslie Irvine who wrote a book, and it's called My Dog Always Eats First, and it's about the relationship, the unique relationship that forms between human beings who have nothing, who live on the street, and the dogs who also have nothing, who are abandoned or stray and find a human who loves and takes care of them. And the more we looked at this relationship, the more profound it became. And we did a couple of films 2 years ago about some homeless people who live on the street with their pets, and the impact was immense because you could see the uniqueness, the things that animals can do for humans and that humans can do for animals. And you realize that the relationship is so mutual. And so within this experience, these assumptions that I had about why homeless people have dogs on the street and the way in which they interact were all wrong. It made me realize that I had taken something incredibly powerful and incredibly beautiful, and through my own cynicism and skepticism, minimized it and dismissed it. And about 2 years ago, we decided that we were going to try and tap into this power by creating a different kind of animal shelter. One that simultaneously, like all animal shelters, was designed to care for and rescue and then ultimately place for adoption abandoned animals that were found on the street in various states of distress or sickness, but one that was run by and then employed exclusively homeless people who live on the street with their pets. And it's been by far the most gratifying thing I've ever done to tap into this energy, this power of the way in which animals and humans can interact and foster the best in one another. The way in which when you give people a sense of purpose that taps into their passion and their empathy and their compassion, they can fulfill their full potential as human beings. And it really began making me think about the fact that this is where all truth and all progress and all passion and all political purpose lies. It's not in the abstract theories and the good politics and the intellectual advancements and the journalistic investigations. All of those are important, but they're meaningless and empty and vacant unless you open yourself up and live those principles in who you are and how you treat others. And I really do believe that this instinct to turn away and to allow ourselves the luxury to avoid suffering can be overcome if we stop making the kinds of assumptions that I made about other people that ended up being so misguided. I think there's this tendency, for example, when we're political activists, to think about certain people being our natural allies and certain people being our natural adversaries. And we talked about this a little bit, actually quite a bit, in the panel discussion today, and I think it's incredibly important. I think for a long time, people who were animal rights activists thought about it as a left-wing cause and thought about liberals and people on the left being our natural allies and conservatives and the hunting culture being our natural adversaries. But I think when you start off with those kind of assumptions about other people, as my own experience just demonstrated, you can really write off a huge possibility, a huge portion and potential for success. Because so much more than liberal and conservative and Democrat and Republican and left and right and all the ways that we try and understand how our politics functions, we have within us this human commonality that ultimately is what will determine how we treat other living beings on the planet, that's so much more important and so much more powerful and so much more universal than the ways that we divide and write each other off. I watched this documentary on the plane coming over here, which I had never seen or heard anything about before. I just kind of randomly watched it on the plane. It's called The Work, and it is an hour documentary about a 4-day intensive therapy program, group therapy program, that is given to prisoners in maximum security prisons, where they take several people from the outside of the prison who are suffering from various psychological crises and integrate them into the therapy group, and they force them for 4 days with almost no breaks in the most intense ways to confront their fears and their vulnerabilities and their anxieties and their emotional pain. And these were people, because it's a maximum security prison, who have been convicted of committing the most gruesome crimes, the most violent crimes, just sociopathically putting bullets into people's heads, cutting people up for no good reason, being part of gangs and committing horrific violence simply for vengeance, killing people that they don't know, people who have really just engaged in the worst criminality. And what I watched over the course of this hour as part of this group therapy were these people confronting their own emotions and their own vulnerabilities and their own fears about why they turned to violence. And over the course of the 4 days, these incredibly hardened criminals who have engaged in remarkable violence were crying and weeping and sobbing, not about guilt over what they had done, but over the fact that their father didn't love them when they were 9, or they felt like they had been rejected by their parents, or they felt like they had been condemned and ostracized when they were children. It actually sounded the way that if you just convened a group therapy class of freshmen at Oberlin, it sounded like that. And they were very authentic. They weren't there to perform. They had nothing to gain by being inauthentic. In fact, it was one of the rawest and most authentic things I had ever watched. And what it made me realize is that although they handled it in much different and worse ways, they were people who had experienced what almost all of us experience, a sense of dislodgement as children, a sense of being alienated and condemned and rejected for who they were. And all of us have strategies for how we coped, and their strategy was violence, but we have these universal impulses in all of us, no matter who we are, that I think we are very ill-advised to write people off as being unreachable, certainly because of their politics or ideology or partisan affiliation in any cause that you believe in, and certainly this cause, which simply asks people to find the empathy in themselves for the suffering and pain of other living beings, is one that should never make assumptions about its own limitations, but should have a limitless sense of possibility about what it can achieve. So the last thing I want to talk about is the issue of change and how change happens and how change is happening because of the work that you're doing. Because one of the things that I think I've come to realize over the past 10, 15 years or so is similar to that experience I had in that taxi cab, is that this instinct to turn away, to ignore suffering, to want to remain blissfully unaware of it is dependent upon our believing that there's nothing that we can actually do about it. The reason I shut my eyes before that cab hit that woman crossing the street is because I couldn't have intervened and stopped it. And that's why I just wanted to not see what would happen. That's where the instinct comes from. And so much of what power centers try and do is to convince us of our own impotence, of our own weakness. And I know just, in the couple of years that I've been really closely speaking with and working with animal rights activists, including the most devoted and the bravest and the most committed ones, is deep down there's almost a sense of hopelessness and helplessness there as well. This idea that I wake up every day, I go to protests, I write material on the internet, I organize, and yet millions and even billions of animals continue to just be let off to slaughter. And on some level, there's a feeling, I think, of defeatism, of this idea that, well, I don't really think that I can really make a difference. I'm going to try, I'm going to feel good about the efforts I do, but I don't really believe that I can stop this. And I think that is the most toxic possible feeling, as natural as it is, and it's the one that I think has to be most strenuously avoided. And I wouldn't say that if I didn't actually think it were true. Like, I don't think there's any benefit in my standing up here and encouraging you to believe things that aren't true because they feel good to believe. I actually believe it. And maybe I believe it and can see it more clearly because I'm new to this movement, and can see it from a little bit more with a little bit more of a buffer. But to begin with, I mean, I just spent the day with a bunch of activists who have rescued animals who would be dead today if not for them, or still suffering in some hideous laboratory or cage, who instead of that are playful and running around and are loved where they belong. That itself is change, just those small little acts. That is a huge change in the life of another living being. Don't discount small change, the change that you make when you rescue a single animal or give love and affection to an animal that's suffering, or to change a single person's mind to give up pork or to give up chicken or to give up beef. Those changes matter, and they accumulate and they compile. Don't tell yourself that the only changes that matter are systemic or fundamental, because to do that is to deny yourself a power that you all have, which is to change the world step by step every single day. Those changes really matter. And then there are the more kind of medium changes that I think are also really important. Just look at polling data about whether people believe that animal experimentation, let alone experimentation on dogs, is permissible. Or look at how corporations now feel the need to at least feign a concern for reform over how they treat animals, whereas 10 years ago they felt no need at all. Or look at the bills that are pending in Congress that have no purpose other than to curb the worst abuses of animal mistreatment, or even to ban the use of taxpayer funds for animal experimentation. None of that was happening 10 or 15 years ago. All of that is happening today because of the work that you all have done. And please do not let yourself or anyone else make you forget that. So I just want to close with the story that was, as I said in the afternoon session, the formative one of my life. And I talked a little bit about it today, and I just want to expand upon it a little bit more, in part because it is the thing that has shaped my political worldview and my view of activism more than any other incident, and because I do think it's just so central of a lesson to think about no matter what kind of cause you're an activist in. So I had talked about earlier this afternoon the work that I did with Edward Snowden, and I just want to tell you briefly the story about why it was so formative in my view of how political change is possible. So I first met Edward Snowden in Hong Kong in June of 2013. I had spent weeks on the phone and by email, actually just by email, communicating with him. In the weeks leading up to that meeting, I had no idea who he was. I knew that he had top secret documents. I knew that he was willing to go to prison for the rest of his life in order to expose them. I knew that just like the EXE activist, he didn't want to hide. He wanted to come out and identify himself because he was not ashamed of but proud of what he was doing and felt he owed the public an explanation. But I didn't know his name, and I didn't know how old he was, and I didn't know how long he had worked in the government. I didn't know where in the government he worked, but he convinced me that it was worth coming to Hong Kong because he sent me a bunch of top secret documents, and when somebody does that, you're willing to get on a plane and go meet them. So, especially when those documents are from the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful government. So, I got on a plane and I went and met him, and in my mind, I was expecting to meet somebody who was in their 60s or 70s. In part, which, you know, is not a weird thing. Like, anytime you talk to somebody on the internet and then go meet them, they never look like what they look like. But this is a really extreme case of that. So I thought he was 60s or in his 60s or 70s because his observations were very sophisticated, because he had access to extremely sensitive documents, which made me assume he was senior in government. And because he told me very clearly that he was willing to go to prison for the rest of his life when he exposed himself, which is exactly what would have happened. I guess on some level I just assume that it's easier to go to prison for the rest of your life if you're 60 or 70 and the rest of your life is 10 years or 20 years, as opposed to 30 and the rest of your life is 60 years in prison. So I just had this assumption, this mental assumption of him and what he would look like and how he would be when I met him. And of course, when I met him, the reality was completely different. You've all seen him. He was 29 at the time, but he looked much younger, like 22 or 23, some mall rat who worked at a video game store. And it was by far the most disorienting and confusing moment of my life because I knew it was real, but none of that made sense and I couldn't put this together. And so when I sat down with him and began interrogating him, the first thing I wanted to know was what his motive was. Like, why, as somebody who was 29 years old with a good career and a girlfriend whom he loved and who loved him and a family that supported him, was he willing to go to prison for the rest of his life for a cause? And I really needed to get to the bottom of this. And ultimately, he gave me an explanation that made sense, which was he talked about how growing up as somebody who was quite poor, the internet was his vessel into the world to speak to people, to explore it, to understand it. He thought that it was the most important human innovation in centuries, and to watch it being turned into a weapon of unprecedented coercion and control as opposed to what it was supposed to be, which was an unprecedented weapon of liberalization and democratization, was not something that he could live with. And what struck me so much about all this at the end of my working with him was not just the fact that to this day he remains the single happiest person that I know, even though he's trapped in a country he never chose to be in and not able ever to return, most likely, to the country where his family ends, because he gets to put his head on his pillow every night knowing that he made a choice to fight for the values he believed in, even at the expense of his own interests, which creates a tranquility that is otherwise unattainable. But it's also what's so amazing about him is his ordinariness. He didn't grow up with any wealth at all. In fact, his father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He didn't graduate high school. He worked as a low-level employee of a huge corporation for many years. He joined the army to go fight in the Iraq War. He was just ordinary in every way. And yet, through nothing more than an incredible act of courage and conviction, he changed the world. He altered diplomatic relations between countries. He changed the way we think about the internet and government secrecy and the role of journalists in democracy. He sparked a debate around the world about what our obligations as citizens are, about what the value of privacy is. He spawned an industry that can protect your communications technologically from being spied on by the FBI and the police and the other agents of the institutions that have sent people here to be among us today. He's enabled you to protect yourself from them. And that is really true, is that if you look at how change happens throughout history, it usually is from people who are just incredibly ordinary. And the lesson that I learned, not just from him, but from so many other examples throughout history, is that every single human institution, any institution built by human beings, no matter how formidable it seems, no matter how powerful it seems, no matter how invulnerable it seems, can be torn down and destroyed and replaced by other human beings if the right conviction and passion and dedication is summoned. And there's so much evidence of that when you find yourself succumbing to this idea that you're not powerful enough to fight huge corporations of industrial agriculture, or the government officials who write laws to protect them, or the people with guns who enforce their will, just think about all of those examples and ultimately realize this, please realize this. The reason that these industries are enacting laws to call you terrorists when you engage in activism that doesn't kill anybody or harm anybody. The reason that Utah officials are prosecuting as felons and racketeers and rioters people who peacefully go into facilities to film what it is that they're doing inside is not because you're losing or because you're too powerless. It's exactly the opposite. It's because you're winning and they fear you. So revel in their fear and revel in your power, because I know sometimes activism can be a slog, and sometimes it can seem like you're not seeing the benefits you want to see as quickly as you want to see them. That's why you're activists. That's what gives you energy. But it can also breed defeatism. But know your own power, know the success that you have, know the righteousness of your cause, and especially know the power that all of us have when we're together. Thank you so much for coming in.